The wax had gone cold on my side of the bed, and the room smelled like a snuffed wick. Sure, that thin thread of smoke that just hangs there in the dark and refuses to leave. He was still beside me. Not the still of sleeping, the other kind. The kind I had learned to read the way you read a drop in air pressure before a storm. Not by seeing anything, just by feeling something shift that you cannot name but cannot miss. My arms ached to the bone. We had put up close to 50 jars of tomatoes since before sunrise, and my palms were marked with little half-moon cuts from the lids, and I was tired in a way that goes past the body and settles into something underneath it. When he reached for me, I put my hand flat against his arm, and I said quietly, quiet enough that the children wouldn't stir in the next room, I said, "I can't tonight. I am sorry. I really can't." He didn't answer. He just started breathing, slow and counted, like a man working through arithmetic in his head. And I don't know why that breathing scared me more than anger would have. Anger I would have known what to do with. My name is Greta. This is Greta from the plane, the channel where I say the things that were never supposed to leave the farmhouse. I grew up old order in Holmes County, Ohio, married at 19, and I left at 28. If you want to keep hearing what life behind the prayer cap actually looked like, subscribe and hit the like button. And tell me in the comments, have you ever apologized for something your body simply could not give? Because I did. That night was the first time. It was not the last. There is a word we were raised inside of. Gelassenheit, yielding, surrender to God, to the Gme, to your husband, in that order, though the lines between the three were always kept just blurry enough that to question one felt like questioning all of them. It was in the hymns and in the sermons, and in the way my mother would go smooth in her face when she disagreed with my father, and then quietly do the thing he wanted anyway. It was in the water. You didn't examine it any more than you examined the reason the sun came up. The bishop in our district had a way of saying it that made it sound like the most natural thing in the world. He would say that a wife's will was a beautiful thing when it learned to bend. And the room would nod, and I would nod. And I was 17, and I thought I understood what he meant. I didn't. Not yet. My husband was a good man, by every measure the community used to take stock of men. He provided. He didn't drink. He showed up when a neighbor needed an extra set of hands for a roof or a sick animal or a hard harvest. He was not cruel. I want to say that plainly because it matters to the story, and it matters to the truth of it. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had been handed a script from the time he was small, and he followed it the way all of us followed the things we had been handed, which is to say, without ever once being asked whether we had chosen it. That is not an excuse. It is just the shape of what happened. The morning after I said no, the silence started. He spoke to our daughter about her chores. He spoke to our son about the fence line that needed mending along the east pasture. He poured his coffee, and he ate his eggs, and he moved through that kitchen like the chair I was sitting in had simply always been empty. Not through me, not around me, just absent of me entirely, the way a room is absent of something it never had. I told myself it was his own tiredness. I told myself one morning would pass into the next, and it would even out, the way most things evening out if you leave them alone long enough. 4 days went by, then 6. On the 7th day, his mother arrived with a pie, and she and my husband sat at the kitchen table for the better part of an hour while I moved around them, refilling coffee, wiping the counter, making myself useful in the small ways women in our community made themselves useful when they had somehow become the problem in a room. His mother left without saying much directly to me. At the door she paused and she looked at the kitchen floor, not at my face, and she said, "A woman who tends her house well never has to wonder where she stands, Greta." Then she was gone. I stood at the sink a long time after the door closed. The second time I said no was 3 weeks later. I was sick, a cold that had moved down into my chest and made it hurt to breathe lying flat. I said it the same way I had said it the first time, hands pressed together under the blanket, voice low. I can't tonight. I am genuinely not well. He turned his back to me without a word, but this time the silence that followed had a different weight to it. Thicker, like something had been decided while I was still thinking it was a conversation. The following Sunday at church, two women who had sat beside me every week for years chose seats at the other end of the table. Not with any drama. They simply were not where they had always been. I told myself I was imagining the significance of it, but you do not imagine things like that when you have spent your entire life being trained to read rooms, to feel the temperature of a gathering, to understand without being told exactly what your position is inside a space. A woman named Fanny Troyer found me afterward at the long tables where we were setting out the food. She was maybe 60, wide-shouldered, the kind of woman who had lived long enough inside the structure to know the location of every wall. She started laying out bread beside me, and she did not look up when she spoke. She said, "They are already calling it a pattern, Greta. The first time is tiredness. The second time is a pattern. You want to be sure there is no third time before it stops being your decision to make." I asked her what she meant. "Decided by who?" I said. She set down the loaf in her hands. She said, "By everyone." That was the whole of it. She moved to the other end of the table, and she did not bring it up again. I want to tell you that I went home that Sunday and sat with what Fanny had said and felt the wrongness of the whole structure and began quietly making some kind of plan. That is not what happened. What happened is I went home and made supper and set the table and did not say no again for 14 months. 14 months. I want you to hold that number for a moment, not as a measure of weakness, not as something to judge, but as a measure of how completely a person can be managed when the walls around her are old enough and solid enough and staffed by enough people who believe with their whole hearts that they are helping her. I thought I was choosing. During those 14 months, I told myself each time that I was being practical, that I was keeping the peace for my children, that I was mature enough to set my own needs aside for the sake of something larger. I felt, in a strange way, almost steady about it, almost wise. But I was not choosing. The choosing had been done for me before I was ever born by a structure that surrounded me on every side. The bishop and the elders and the mothers-in-law and the women at the tables who appeared to deliver small, terrible warnings dressed as casual conversation. A real choice needs room to exist. It needs at least two options that do not cost you everything. I had no such room. What I did not expect, and this is the part I have never said out loud before, is that somewhere inside those 14 months, I went quiet. The thing I had been trying to protect when I said no, the tiredness, the sense that my body was mine and had limits that deserved to be respected, it stopped making noise. And for a while I thought that was healing. I thought the community had been right all along, that the yielding had smoothed something rough in me that needed smoothing, that this was what maturity felt like when it finally settled in. It was only years later, after I left, when I was talking to a woman who ran a support group for women who had come out of high-control communities, that I understood what had actually happened during those 14 months. She didn't use complicated language. She just said, sometimes when a person cannot find a way out, they leave from the inside instead. I carried that sentence for weeks before I knew what to do with it. I left on a cold Tuesday in October with my 2 children and a box of things, and that particular kind of calm that does not come from peace, but from having finally made a decision so large it has already consumed your fear before you even walk out the door. The shunning followed. My mother at the window of the farmhouse the last time I drove past, hands at her sides, not moving. My sister turning away from me in a parking lot a year and a half later, as though I were not someone she had grown up beside, but a reminder of something she was working hard not to think about. I do not blame them. That is not emptiness talking. I genuinely do not blame them. They are standing inside the same structure I stood inside. They are doing the only thing the structure leaves room for. But here is what I think about sometimes when this house is finally quiet and my children are asleep. I think about Fanny Troyer and the careful way she warned me without quite warning me, hands always moving while she spoke. Like if she went still, someone would know she had said something she wasn't supposed to say. She didn't tell me to leave. She didn't tell me I was right to be tired. She just told me what was coming so I wouldn't be blindsided by it when it arrived. That is the smallest possible thing a person can do. But I think about what it cost her to do even that much. What she went home to that night, whether she had her own Fanny once at some earlier table, in some earlier year, telling her to make sure there was no third time, whether it helped her, whether it ever helped anyone. If something in this stayed with you, leave it in the comments. Tell me what part. And if you want to keep hearing the stories that were never meant to leave the plane, subscribe to Greta from the Plane. I have been carrying this for a long time. I am only just beginning to put it down. Un ton.